Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Professor Lindsey Cormack and Heidi Stevens. Thanks for joining us. Our YouTube channel has an archive of over 350 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. Tonight's recording will be posted this week. And now for tonight's introductions. Lindsey Cormack is an associate professor of political science and director of the Diplomacy Lab at Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey. Since 2009, she has run the DC Inbox Project. We were just hearing about it behind the scenes. It's fascinating. Archiving and providing to the public all official e-newsletters sent by members of Congress. Professor Cormack's research has been published in popular outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, 538, ProPublica, Roll Call, the New York Post, The Conversation, NBC News, and more. Heidi Stevens is a Chicago-based writer and the creative director of Parent Nation, an initiative of the University of Chicago's TMW Center for Early Learning and Public Health, which works to provide parents, caregivers, and communities the knowledge and tools to optimize foundational brain development in all children. Prior to joining the U of C, Heidi worked at the Chicago Tribune for 23 years, where she wrote a daily column called Balancing Act, which is now a nationally syndicated weekly column. Heidi has also served on the FAN Board of Directors since September 2021. Now let's welcome Lindsey Cormack and Heidi Stevens.
And thank you everybody at FAN for bringing these kind of programs to us and educating us and illuminating these kind of thorny topics week in and week out for free. Honestly, keeping me sane right now. So thank you, Lonnie and Lindsey. It's so nice to be here with you tonight. Thanks for joining us all the way from New York. Before we dive into my questions, do you mind giving all of us a little bit of background on your book? Just kind of set the stage for us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Heidi. I'm excited to talk with you and I'm excited to get into those questions. And before I tell you a little bit about the background of the book, thank you to Lonnie and Anne Marie and everyone at the Family Action Network for putting this together. I'm pumped that we're doing it. So this book was born out of my experience being a college professor for 10 years. I work at a school called Stevens Institute of Technology, and it is a wonderful place to work. I have really bright students. They're so good at doing school. They take high test scores to get in, and then they go on to great careers. But as the person who sees them in the introductory level government class, I quickly realized they didn't know a lot about the government structures that they were graduating into, things that they were going to be able to influence through voting, but they really didn't understand the landscape at all. As a part of my work at Stevens, when I was fairly new there, they said, you know what, I think you should do our voter registration and our voter outreach efforts. I took this on, not knowing, how big that was going to be, but I realized the problem is more than what we can handle in a semester-long course as a college professor. And so I assembled a research team of 6 undergraduates, and I said, let's go figure out how we teach civics, politics, and government to people throughout the United States, because then we can have a better handle on what we're going to do at the college level. And originally, we thought we were going to write a book, sort of like a book that a woman named Holly Corby wrote, that was going to say, like these states are doing it this way and it's really working and these states aren't. But what we found out in the course of this research is that it's actually really hard to get your hands around how we teach civics and government and politics in the United States because we do not have a uniform curriculum. Instead, we really have like 50 different curriculums that happen at the state level. And really, that gets devolved down to school boards, and that then gets devolved down to individual schools. So this ended up becoming a parenting book, and its structure is pretty straightforward. I spell out the problem at first, and I think we're all sort of familiar with this. A lot of us lack civic know-how. We really don't understand our systems. We don't know where to pull when we need to fix something. We also don't always know how to exercise our own power. And then I go into the risks of having this, which is, if our government can't reflect us, it's not going to do the work that we want. We're not going to get the outcomes that we want.
Right.
And that risks people being disillusioned, no longer wanting to participate, or distrusting government. And even you can get to violent outcomes. I go through the routes for how we got here in the first place, like what sort of had to be undone for us to get to this state of disrepair in our civics. And then I make the argument that parents have to be the agents of change. I want a lot of this work to get done in schools, but right now it's very hard given some of the constraints that they're facing. And so if we really want our politics to feel and function better, I say we're going to have to take this on in our homes, in our communities, in our families, extended families, and friend networks. And then the second half of the book tells you how to do this and offers a primer for a lot of parents who feel like maybe they didn't learn enough the first time around, or maybe they don't feel as confident in these subjects, and that's why they maybe don't have conversations. And then at the end, I send you on your way and I say, here's where you can go from here. Now that you've put these sort of lessons under your belt, now that you sort of understand the importance of doing this work, how can you continue to do that, depending on wherever your child is developmentally or the sorts of interests they have? That's sort of the arc of how this book works.
Thank you for that. That's really, really good level setting. And I love the way you spell out why you're talking directly to parents. It's not so much that these lessons shouldn't happen in school or that schools wouldn't be good at it. We sometimes get bogged down in that. I don't want schools teaching my child this topic. I want to remain in control of what they learn and when they learn it. It's not that so much. It's that schools are, for a variety of reasons, spending classroom time on other topics. I think that you write civics gets the smallest amount of classroom instruction time of any subject in K through 12, correct?
That's absolutely correct. It has the smallest amount of time dedicated in terms of curricular time throughout the United States, and it has the least amount of funding. So our prioritization of it is when we're like, it's not hard to understand why kids don't get it. We aren't giving it to them.
We aren't giving it to them. Yeah, I think you wrote that for every $50 spent on STEM, it's something like 5 cents on
Yeah, that's the ratio. For every $50 that goes
civics.
to STEM in K through 12, only 5 cents goes to civics. And it's such an incredible imbalance. And I'm someone who works at a STEM university. I very much appreciate the benefits that all of our lives get to enjoy because of STEM education. But I also know that this counterbalance kind of has to get shifted if we want our politics to feel better.
Sure, sure. Well, I like that you said our politics to feel better because obviously this conversation feels incredibly timely right now, right? There's a presidential election less than a week away. Some people who are joining us tonight have probably already even voted. Um, but one of the things that your book does such a good job of is reminding us that like this is a very evergreen topic, right? This is important all year round, every year, whether we're talking about primaries, whether we're talking about midterms, whether we're talking about school board elections. There are ways and there are reasons to engage our kids and inform our kids about politics, about government, about being a citizen.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think it's important to have these conversations now because as someone who's seen a lot of political cycles, I know that we really only get 4 or 5 presidential elections with our kids before they are voting eligible adults themselves. And so right now it feels, like kind of dire. Everyone's focused on it. It's all the media can talk about. And that can feel overwhelming, but that also is a big opportunity because that means it's sort of unavoidable. These conversations are going to get pushed in front of us because they're coming from all sides. And so it's important to do it now, but it's also important, like you said, to recognize the evergreenness of this. Everything is political. It's always going to be that way. And just because we're going to have a presidential election behind us in a week's time doesn't mean we're not going to have midterms 2 years from now. Doesn't mean we're not going to have school board or state level or other municipal elections that are happening all the time throughout the United States. So it's a lesson that we can't really stop learning. And we just have a lot of opportunities to take what we have in this, frenzied presidential period and say, okay, what I'm learning here can matter in a different way, but I might have to port it to a state level or a city or local level to kind of think
Yeah.
about what's the next thing for me to master.
Yeah. Well, that also helps politics seem less sort of theoretical or abstract to kids, right? It doesn't have to necessarily mean donating money to a candidate or attending a rally. It can be understanding that, like, if my alleys aren't paved, that's about government. If my school that my friends and I go to is funded or isn't funded, that's about government, right? So that sort of helps kids who, in the ages that we're, addressing, that you're addressing in the book, can't necessarily vote yet, can't necessarily, don't have money to donate yet. It can help them still feel empowered to create change and to get involved in some way, right? If they understand that like so many parts of their lives are affected by government way before they can vote.
Absolutely. And for everyone who's under 18, that's the reality that they're going to be in, is that their agency is limited. They're not going to be giving money to campaigns. They're not going to be voting. That doesn't mean that they're not political or that they don't matter or that they can't be
Yeah.
effective. It means you really have to go find those other ways, those other entry points to do it. And like you said, that can be recognizing things in your neighborhood where you're like, you know what? I wish this was better. Man, I really wish we had basketball courts here. Maybe I don't like that the people who are playing pickleball took over all of our free space. These are, competing for finite resources and thinking about how communities are going to distribute things fairly or prioritize things fairly. Kids notice that sort of stuff, and then we just have to give them the tools to say, like, okay, if we want to fix or fiddle with these things, who do we talk to? How do we get this done? What's the process? And that's something that really happens at the local level far more than it does at the federal level, because you're just going to be observing where you live. Your local politics are the closest thing that you're ever going to get to experience.
Right, exactly. And you point out kids notice that stuff, and talk about people who are have their antenna up about what's fair and whether rules are followed, right? If you've ever played a board game with a kid, or played Go Fish with a kid, they have an eagle eye for, like, did you follow the rules? Is that fair? Did he get more than I got? Did she get more than I got? Right? So, like, in some ways, kids are they're the perfect audience to tap into some of that stuff, right?
I think they absolutely are. And I think you're right. When you watch kids play board games, they're doing politics. Or if you watch kids fight over,
Hmm.
who gets to use the swings, if there's not enough for everyone, who gets to
Right.
go down the slide first. Or even when we see young kids playing sort of like online games like Roblox or Minecraft, they are engaged in proto-politics because, like, it's unavoidable in a communal setting. You have to make group decisions. Not everyone gets everything,
Hmm.
not everyone wins. And we know that our children are really good at especially petty legalese, where it's like, no, 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 it's just this one little thing. They're great at that. They see these things because they're trying to make sense of their world. And that's part
Yeah.
of it, is trying to say, like, what's fair, what's not fair, who gets to do what, what's the process, what's the turn taking. And we just don't always cast it as politics, but it is truly proto-politics. It's the building blocks that you need to get into the higher levels of it.
Yeah, yeah, it's taking that sense of fairness and sense of justice and leveraging it to teach them about the world around them, right?
So much. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I love that. So you're really clear in this book that raising a citizen is different than raising a partisan. Talk a little bit about that.
Thank you for asking that, because I think that's incredibly important. So there's a few things happening here, but I like to start with an analogy when we think about this. If you're trying to raise a citizen, I try to think about it as if you're trying to raise an athlete. So let's say you had a child that you wanted to be really good at playing soccer. If you wanted that for your child, you'd teach them the rules. You'd say, like, here's how many people can be on the field, here's how long the halves are, here's what the referee does. And then in order for them to develop their skills, you'd say, like, okay, let's go do some practice. Let's scrimmage with some other people. Let's run some conditioning drills. We'll do some training. Maybe we'll do some weightlifting, get strong where we need to get strong. Then you would make a student who's or a child who's a better athlete at soccer because they understand the rules, they've done some practice, they've trained, they've done different variations, they got it. If you were trying to raise a fan, you wouldn't do the same thing. If you're just trying to raise a good
Mm,
soccer fan, you might say, here's the colors that we like to wear. We paint our faces this way. Here's the chants that we do. Here's how we taunt the other teams. Here's the best players that we've ever looked up to. Here's the ones that we never talk about. But in politics, we can't really raise our kids to be spectators or fans because no one truly is on the sidelines in politics. We're all just differently capable athletes. And the
mm,
ones who get better outcomes, the one who gets wins or goals in the soccer analogy, are the ones who have practiced, who understand the game, who know how to play, and have done repeated experiences at it. And so, really, we all want to raise our kids to be these political athletes. We want them to be in the game because they're in the game no matter what. So we prepare them for being better at that game by showing them how it works. And when we think about raising a partisan, it's not even clear that we can do it effectively. So, emerging
mhm.
research that I get into the book talks about how if you're a Republican and you say, I really want to raise a little Republican, or if you're a Democrat and you say, I really want to raise a little Democrat, you might get that. 50% of the time, you can kind of pass on your own sort of parental partisanship to your child. But the other 50% of the time, you either turn them off to politics altogether by talking about it
Mhm,
too much and them saying, you know what, I don't want to be involved in this, or you get
mhm.
someone who's on the opposite side. And so it's not even clear that that should be a goal for people. We don't need to
Right.
tell them which teams to root for. We want to show them how the game is played and trust that once they understand the procedures, they can pick the team that works for them in the same way we're all able to pick the teams that work for us. And I'll finally say, I don't think it should be a goal because even if you were to raise someone who sees the world in a different partisan view than you, that's not a marker of failure. In some ways, it's a marker of success. It
Yeah,
recognizes that we're going to go through this world on different journeys, different starting points, different endpoints. And if we can coexist in a way that exists like in the love of a family and can hold both of these different things, that's great. That is what we probably need more of instead of saying, like, oh, if you don't see this my way, you're not a part of my family, or you don't make any
right,
sense to me. Our politics
right.
is not better that way, and it's inevitable that we're going to see things differently. So trust that if you teach your kids the rules, they'll figure out the team that they want to root for, and the teams change over time. So there's no need to make sure that they look at it in the same way you do.
I I love every single one of those points. I love that analogy. I love that lesson. I love that as a North Star. And I think that as you're talking, it's making me think that, of course, none of these things should be fixed either, right? Like you shouldn't decide at a certain age, I pledge allegiance to this party. And, because my parents did, or because I was raised hearing, horrible ththings about the other side. And forevermore, those are my beliefs, right? We should all be learning and evolving and growing and opening our minds and hearts as we go, as we learn, as we, have our blind spots reduced, hopefully. So I love that model that you just set up.
Thank you. And I think you're right. Like normatively, we should be open to change. Normatively, we should be understanding that we're evolving beings, and so are the parties that can be outside of us. But it also is true for us just to be like effective in our own politics. Sometimes you have to recognize that maybe a party you've liked for a long time isn't serving you anymore, or their sort of goals have diverged from yours. And that's not bad. That's not something where you say, like, oh, I got it wrong. That's how we choose everything. Sometimes things no longer serve us, and we have to make a decision to break from what we've done in the past. That's not a problem, but we need to show our kids that sort of flexibility. We need to model that sort of like information seeking behavior. And we can't do that if we say you have to lock in to say one side is the right way to do it. It's just not
Mm-hmm.
possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So true. Um, so uh, in addition to, I think probably what a lot of parents butt up against that we're just talking about is this feeling of like, they're only young ones, they're children. Can't I protect the innocence of their childhood? Do I really need to go into the three branches of government, or do I really need to, tune them into all of the problems of the world when really they should just be out playing soccer, right? Or hanging out with their friends, or worrying about what to wear at Halloween. Um, First of all, before I go on, answer that, because I'm certain you hear that. I certainly hear that. So what do you say to
Yeah, I
parents who
mean,
say like, I don't want to burden my child with this stuff? He's a child. She's a child. That shouldn't be on their mind right now.
absolutely. I hear that a lot when I'm talking to like PTAs or different parent salons. Like they sort of have this impulse that I think feels protective, which is
Mm-hmm.
I kind of want to give them sort of a bubble where they can just exist and they don't have to know about this outside reality. Parents recognize that they're going to have to confront it eventually, but like maybe just not right now. And nothing that I write says like, make sure you sit down and talk about like the Israel-Palestine disagreements with your children from an early age. No. You know your kids best. You know what they can tolerate. You know what they can handle. But the idea that we protect them from this by not talking about it in front of them or with them, around them at all, that's not true. Because we move from a place of protection to not preparing them. And so it's
Mm-hmm.
not that you need to sit down with your 5-year-old and spell out, here's federalism beginning to end. Here's all the three branches and checks and balances. But my plea is that we do not avoid it all entirely because we think, oh, they'll figure it out when they're older. Oh, they're going to learn it at school because they're really having a hard time learning this at school. And we also
Mm-hmm.
know that we, as their parents, we are their best role models. They get to spend the most time looking up to us, and we get to spend the most time molding them. And if they never see us caring about politics, if they never see us having a discussion, if they never see us information seeking, if they never see us voting or doing anything that's sort of civic minded, they are going to get the message that they don't need to do that either. And so it's not that you need to sit down and debate with your children or try to make them defend opinions, but I do think that parents should let their kids see them caring about something and let them see them being a part of this communal process because it's unavoidable. It doesn't mean you have to scare them. It doesn't mean you have to give them every detail. But if they come to you with a question, I do think you should be willing to have it out with them. And I'll give you an example that happened in my life. When the Dobbs decision came down, my daughter was 10, and she asked me what an abortion was. And it's something where at 10, we had talked about pregnancy. She sort of understand how babies came into the world, but we had not talked about abortion because we really hadn't had a need to in my house. And I knew when she asked me about that, if I didn't tell her or have some sort of conversation with her, she was going to walk into her room and be like, "Hey, Alexa, what's an abortion?" I was like, I don't know that I want to put her into the vagaries of the internet to figure out these questions. I want to be the person that she can have these conversations with. So I hear
That's
it
right.
all the time. Parents are like, "I don't want to do this. I want to protect them." I think the reality is it's very hard to protect them as soon as they're of that age where they can go sort of information seek themselves, whether that's on a smartphone or a tablet or a computer or an Alexa. We have to be willing to do this work because the world's not going to wait for it. And it's better if we can do it than whatever they're going to find in the internet that can be sometimes kind of fearsome.
That's right. I think that's such an excellent point. And I really liked the piece you wrote in the 74 this week about you brought up that example about your daughter. And to take it a step farther, I thought it was so interesting because you said, here we are talking about how little time, how little classroom time is devoted to civics. At the same time, you have kids surrounded by a 24/7 media landscape to the point where, your daughter probably couldn't avoid the Dobbs decision, whether you tried to have her avoid it or not. And I don't know, and it doesn't even necessarily matter. But the point that you made was that when you were growing up, if you had asked, or if a child had asked a grown up at age 10, what's an abortion? There's a really good chance the answer would have been, I'll tell you when you're older. And maybe that would have been the end of the discussion. But now that doesn't work. A child is going to go Google it, or go, like you said, to Alexa. So whatever sort of old days we're harkening back to, are our own childhoods that we might be harkening back to, like those days are over. You
Yeah, I
saying
think
I'll
that's
answer that
right.
when you're older that's just you not getting to be the person that answers the question, and that's not the end of the question.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's not just true for politics. I mean, I think I'd caution parents that for anything, like if your kids come to you with questions about sex or drugs or alcohol, it's like, yeah, we have to be willing to do this with them because they are going to go find this information. And you're right. If someone brushed me off 30 years ago, it's not like I was going to go to the library and go get the Encyclopedia Britannica and go look
Right.
it up. Like, that's right. The end of it. I'm not going to know this right
That,
now. But that's not
that's
the
right.
reality anymore.
That's right. Yeah. I want to stay actually on that piece for a little bit, the piece you wrote for the 74, because you spelled out three ways to, or three sort of points to keep in mind when you're talking to your kids about politics, about abortion, about, you know, tough, timely issues. And the first one was to recognize your role, which I think we've talked a little bit about. But is there more that you want to say about that, about recognizing your role in these conversations?
What I mean by that is like we are our kids' first teachers, whether we like it or not. We are the ones who they're
Mhm.
just like going to see. And so, like I said earlier, if we avoid things, they're going to avoid things. But if they see us sort of approach stuff with like a curiosity, where we say like, "Ooh, you know what? Maybe I don't know everything about that. Let's go figure that out together." Then they're going to understand like that's a model that they can use. That they don't have to know everything. They don't have to just like rely
Mhm.
on whatever's in their brain to answer a question. They can go seek out different perspectives if they want. They can go find other things. And that's a skill that doesn't just serve them in like politics. That's like a critical grit enhancing skill of saying like, "Oh, you know what? I can like learn a little bit more because I saw someone who showed me what it was to learn when they didn't know things." So that's the first thing I think we need to do as parents is recognize they're watching us all the time and we owe it to them to give them a good model of what to do when we're uncertain, when we don't know something.
Right. Right. You mentioned in the book, I loved this line that so much of what kids pick up is something that they've caught rather than something that we've taught. Right. So we might think, well, I'm not going to teach them that right now, but they're going to catch a lesson about it. Right.
Yeah, and I mean it's part
Yeah.
of, like they learn from what we do and they learn from what we don't do. And we probably focus more on what we do because it's like, our conscious decisions. We decided to do X and not Y, but they learn in those absences too. And so we just have to like really recognize that like they're watching us for every little piece, whether it's active or inactive, they're gonna get a message about that.
Absolutely. The second point, and I think this one's probably tricky for a lot of us, was to restrain your negativity. And it's easy, especially right now, for some of us to, slip into negativity when you're talking about policies that you don't like, specific candidates that you don't like, disparaging um, any part of the process. Talk about why it's important to resist that urge.
So here's something that happened when we were researching this book. There's sort of two strategies that happen in different parts of the country, different families, different cultures. The first one is like not talking about politics at all, which is this one where I say like, okay, you got to recognize your role. If you don't talk about it, they're going to learn they shouldn't think about it. But the second sort of approach is if we do talk about politics, it's all really negative. Like our kids are going to get messages like, you know, everyone's a liar. They're all crooks. They're in it for themselves. The system is rigged. They're egomaniacs. And if we teach our kids that's what politics is, it's not surprising they're not going to go want to learn more. It's like no one wants to go hang out with the liars and the egomaniacs and the cheaters. Like that's not where you want to be. And that sort of negativity is something that even if we don't do that in our homes, they are getting that message. Like when you look at children's literature and children's media, even things that are as young as like Paw Patrol, you're going to have a mayor character in a lot of these stories who
Mm,
at best is like this little bumbling doofus who barely gets by and then the day is saved by something
mm.
else. Or at worst, they're out to do harm to the city that they're meant to serve and protect. And so they are getting these anti-government, anti-politics messages. And
So
so I think
interesting.
it's true though. It is like children's
Yeah, it
literature has a
totally
lot of
is.
these archetypes. And so
Yeah.
for parents, I make the argument that, though there are things that we might disagree with, though there are things that we might not like in our politics, if all they hear is it's negative, it's bad, they're never going to aspire to it. They're never going to dream of it. And when we ask kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? Gallup has been doing this for decades. They used to say things like the president. Now the president isn't even in the top 20. And instead, the thing that our kids most want to be is an influencer, a TikToker, a
Mm,
content creator. And that's because we have some sort of like positivity around that. I want us to have positivity around people who are doing the work of government because truly we need more people who want to do that work and do it well. And it is my truest understanding that most politicians at the state and local level are truly trying their best to serve communities in a way that they think are good. Most people are not out there to go do harm to others. Why would you enter into a low paying, low prestige job where everyone yells at you? You have to be on the road all the time and everyone's watching your every move. It's people who
mm,
want to do that work. They want to do good things. We might
mhm,
disagree on what those good things are, but it's
mhm,
not usually people who are out to trying to hurt others, despite the fact that that's the narrative we get. And you can make that argument at the federal level, and I can understand it with some credence. But for most
mhm,
of the people doing state and local stuff, they're practically volunteers. They're like the
mhm,
people who are just pitching in because they want the community to work a little bit better. And we need to let our kids know that it's not all bad work. A lot of it's really good work. And it's necessary. We don't have a functioning fire system or police department or EMT service if we don't have administrators doing the work of government. So we have to have it anyhow.
Right. So how do parents thread that needle when someone who is active and vocal in politics tells a racist joke, lies about a vulnerable group, does something that we certainly would not condone in our own homes?
Yeah,
Uh,
that's hard. That's really hard. And I think we've all sort of had a front row to that for a long time now. So people who are raising children, I have a 12-year-old, most of her political understanding of life has had sort of that in it. That's also been true for nearly, for a lot of our lives in different variations. I think we don't necessarily shield them from it, but we let them sort of have an internal barometer and say if that like feels good or bad. And most of our kids are primed to think that when people make fun of other people, that feels bad. They get those
mhm,
messages in all sorts of like early educational developmental stages where it's like, we're sharing, we're understanding what it is to care for others, we understand what it is to be giving. And so it's not likely that kids are going to see that sort of mean behavior and think like, ooh, I really like that. So I know that there's like an impulse of parents to point it out, and you might say that's not consistent with our family values. That's totally fine. But I do think it's okay to expose them to like routine processes like the debates. So if you have, a child who wants to watch a presidential debate and you're maybe nervous that something might get said that feels racist in your understanding of it, or maybe it feels sexist or something like that, that stuff is going to be out in the world anyhow. That stuff is going to be a part of our politics. And so it's something where our kids can see it if they're of an age that you deem appropriate to see that. And then you can have that discussion with them. Like, how does that feel? Is that something who would you want as your teacher? Would you want them to coach your sports team? Is that someone you'd want as a friend? And then sort of work through what sort of values you have for those sorts of positions, and trust that they're probably going to translate that into how they understand politics in a better way, instead of just adding on negativity, instead of saying like, oh, that person's, a bully for saying this. Let them sort of think it through with you and have that out. And they're probably going to get to the outcome that you understand. Maybe not always, and that's okay because plenty of people see things differently. But I think piling on is not the better thing to do in that, instead of sort of like asking them questions.
I like that you brought up questions, and that reminds me of a part of your book where you talk about having 4 questions that you use in class. And I think they can be easily translated at home, right? And it starts with, what have you heard about that? So tell us why you start with that, and then go into the other 3 questions.
Yeah. What have you heard is the question that I use in my classroom and my home. And I think it's an incredibly important starting point, because from here on out, it's never going to be the case that any one of us is hearing the same media landscape. And what I mean by that is, we don't have 3 channels anymore, we're all aware. But really, most of our information seeking is stuff that comes to us algorithmically, and it's cut up to what you want to see versus what I want to see versus what my child wants to see. And no one is seeing the same configurations of things, and they never will ever again, because it's just not how media consumption works. And so when you ask someone, what have you heard? You are first setting the table with what it is that their media diet provides to them. They're going to say like, oh, I heard this on Instagram, or maybe I heard this in my class, or someone said this on the bus. And it releases them from having to defend those things, because they don't have to defend those things, but we can't enter into a good faith conversation if we don't know the starting points. And so when you say, what have you heard? You allow every participant in that conversation to say like, oh, I heard this. And they might say, I just saw a tweet, or I just read a headline, or I heard it on a podcast. So they might not have a greater, more well-formed opinion. But if that's the only entry point they have, then whatever it is they're going to think about this, you can understand a little bit more of how they got there, because that's what they've heard. And the same can be true. If you ask your child, what have you heard? They put it all out there. Then you can enter and say like, oh, well, here's what I've heard. Or I haven't heard that. I heard this. And so we all sort of just like place our little things on the table and say, okay, here's our starting point. That's question 1. And I like it because it sets the table, and it means you're not responsible for defending something, because that's when people get defensive in politics. So you just say like, prove to me you're right. They don't have to do that. That's not what you're asking. You're just putting it all out there.
Right. Or come to me with all the facts, or, or we're not talking until you've done your homework. Right. I think kids can feel nervous, or any of us at any age can feel nervous about engaging in a, sort of high level, high stakes conversation without sort of reams of evidence on our side. Right.
Absolutely. And that's just like not the world that we're ever going to be in. I mean,
That's right.
even for political experts, you can't go deep in every topic. You're not going to know everything about every topic. You might have bigger, broader strokes that are more informed than others, but there's always going to be nuances and niches that you're not into. And so, like you said, for children and adults, just put it out there. Like, what is it? Instead of saying like, make sure you're an expert on this before we get into it.
Right. Yeah. Model that there's no shame in that. And like you said, you can say, I don't know about stuff you don't know. What's the next question after what have you heard about that?
That's where I then move into, what do you think about that? And there's a huge difference between what you've heard and what you think. And that's sort of in the synthesis of information, where you say like, I heard these things. I have some background knowledge, or maybe an experience in a related or different way, so that I can like put together a thought. But what do you think is not how are you right? It is not how am I wrong? It is what do you think on that? And you have to make sure you do it from like a place of curiosity, from a place that understands that you're probably going to have a bias yourself, but you're not asking them to persuade you. And when you're doing it on the other side, you're not trying to persuade them. You're just trying to take what you think or what they think and appreciate that as a journey that's going to be different from one another because we had those different starting points. We have different processing. We have different life experiences. I'm just trying to figure out what it is you think about this thing.
Mm-hmm. And then what comes after that?
And then it gets harder. Then you go to what do you know? And this is something where in my classrooms, the gap between what you think and what you know can be really big, where
Mm,
that's something that does feel inhibiting, that does slow down a conversation, that does put someone a little bit back on their heels. And this is why you have to make sure you're doing it from a place of like generous curiosity instead of
yeah.
like, let me put you into a corner that you really don't know that much. Because frankly, you probably don't either. And so when you have that space between like what do you think and what do you know, it's a time for sort of like a humble reflection on like, you know what? I know this. And it might be like, I know that in my life, when I've gone to the DMV, it happens to turn out this way or something. How do you know that?
Mm,
You experienced it. You might say, I know that when I read this report, it said that this many people were serving this much of a population to do X, Y, or Z. But that's very different sometimes than what you think about an overall problem, but you only have this like little nugget of knowledge, and that's okay. We just have to make sure that we're gentle with each other when we get to that point instead of being like, haha, you don't know that much at all. Because,
mhm.
like I've said for nearly everything else, most of us don't on most of
Right.
these issues. We have a limited set of tools available to us and a limited set of life experiences to really know things. And so we
Mm-hmm.
just have to make sure when we're talking to our children or to other people about this, we give them that same grace to be like, okay, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
the thoughts are a lot bigger than the things we know, but that's
Mm-hmm.
fine. We're just trying to like
Mm-hmm.
get to a place where we understand each other better.
That's right. What's the fourth question?
And that last one is what more would you like to know? And this is something
Mm,
where then you can kind of do that information seeking together. Sometimes your children are going to be done with you before this. Sometimes you only get through what have I heard? They don't really want to
sure.
move to what do you think? What do you know? Once you've done that, though, the question of what more would we want to know is a way for you to think about how will I refine my opinion? How could I come back to this? How could I appreciate someone else's perspective? And so,
Mm-hmm.
if you've laid out what it is that you know, and then you can say like, ooh, but I do recognize that there's gaps here, or ooh, I haven't quite figured out that piece of this puzzle. When you have that, even just like going into the like mental list of like, what more would I want to know? That doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to go figure that out right then. It doesn't mean that you're going to go figure it out next week, but it does mean that you're going to just have this little window where it's like, you know what? There is more to learn here. There is more to figure out. I might not be totally right. Or you might say like,
Mm-hmm.
there's nothing more to learn. It's open and shut. I've got it all figured it out. But it's
Mm-hmm.
important to go through the process so that you can sort of make sure that you kind of see where your gaps are and then appreciate that other people are going to have gaps too, and just sort of roll that into the process of how we get to know each other, how we understand our political views, because that's how we all sort of come to these sorts of opinions, thoughts, knowledge bases, and things that we're going to seek more information for in the future.
Yeah. Can you take us inside your classroom to an exercise where that has happened recently that was especially illuminating or memorable for you? One of those
You
conversations
know,
that started with those questions?
I'll have to take you back a little bit further, because right now, teaching in an election is really it's just so much of like let's roll with exactly what's happening today.
Sure.
There's so much information coming at us, and I'm teaching in two intro classes right now, and so we're not doing a ton of this work. We're doing a lot of like what's going to happen in these swing states. But in the past, I remember when there were Syrian refugees, when this was a story. I think this is pre-pandemic. And some of our students had really strong opinions on what the United States should do. Like, should we raise caps on immigrants coming in? Should we keep it as is? And in going through that, what have you heard? What do you think? What do you know? We sort of
Mm-hmm.
learned together that a lot of us had heard different things or seen different pictures or had little snippets of information to us. What do you think could have been, like, I don't think anyone should be able to come here. I do think the United States should have open arms for people. We would ask questions about, like, well, what if they were children? What if they were adults? What do we think about that sort of variation? And doing that, I think, was uncomfortable for our class because we did have different opinions on it. but it's
Yeah.
also something that you kind of have to confront because politics is hard. Some of this stuff we got to grapple with. Some of this stuff is like really difficult and squishy. But as long as you're not personalizing it to say, ooh, you think something that's different than me, which means you're either evil or a dummy, then you can get to a place of saying, like, okay, I'm learning about how different people are approaching this. I'm understanding that our policy goals are probably going to be different because if you're starting from a place of like, I think we ought not have more people, or I think we should accept more people, you're going to go to different places. We don't necessarily need to say one is wrong, one is worse, but we understand that they're just going to be very different. And that particular moment in sort of foreign politics and American politics was tricky for the class to get through, but I'm glad that we had the structure to sort of walk through and the practice because my students know, and I tell them this at the very front, I was like, we're not here to persuade each other. That's not what's going to happen in class. It's not usually what's going to happen in life. It's more to
Right.
understand each other. And so these are tools and exercises to sort of understand how different people might process and approach things, not necessarily how you're going to convince them that they're wrong and you're right.
That's such an interesting framing of the entire conversation we're having tonight. And I'm thinking about, I don't think this part was in your book. I think this might have been one of your Medium essays I read, but where you talked about the fact that you should talk about politics at Thanksgiving. I think a lot of us here like, no politics at Thanksgiving. But the questions that you suggested were unexpected and so smart. And it was like, ask, what did it take for you to register to vote? Like, tell me your register to vote story. Or, considering all of the different reasons that people have immigrated to the United States over time, how do you think we should approach immigration policy? What kind of infrastructure improvements do you think we would both most benefit from in our community? Not what candidate do you like, what candidate do you hate? Can you believe this one said that? Can you, like, that's not necessarily politics. It is politics, but that's not the whole of politics. And I think to your point, if we're really getting to know one another and we're really getting to learn from one another, and also, sharpen our own thinking and understanding, those kinds of questions can be really, really valuable.
Yeah, I think you're
And
right.
we're
You're pointing
modeling
out.
that to our kids who hopefully are sitting at the table, right? Or who are sitting at the kids' table a couple feet away.
Yeah, no, that's totally right. I remember this. So this is I have a different Thanksgiving assignment every year, but it's usually a variation of that. And so I imagine the
That you
infrastructure
give to your
yours,
students?
yeah, they always have to talk
Okay.
to like two people at Thanksgiving, and they write a little paper on it to say, like what they learned from this. And I sort of like let them sort of pick their own adventure. There's going to be multiple ways that they can do it. But I think it's important that when we have like this infrastructure question, I mean, we all know there's infrastructure upgrades that can be made. Some people think, it's going to be like dams and rivers and roads. And some people are like, no, it's going to be rail and public transit. We're going to have bike lanes. And those things aren't necessarily wedded to partisan outcomes that are known a priori, but you can have conversations around someone says like, if we had some more money to spend on this, what would you do? And that's probably a more productive way to like think about your own sorts of opinions on this than which candidate do you think is going to get it done better? Because that's sort of like giving your agency over to someone else or sort of like making a different style of argument versus thinking about, ooh, if I could do this, what is it that I would want or how have I approached this in the past? And so I think when we say talk politics, that doesn't have to mean who are you voting for and why. It can
Right.
mean, given that a lot of things happen in a political framework where there's political decision making, what would you do? And that's like a different way to think about it that puts us as the agents versus just people who are selecting people to act on our behalf.
Yeah. What's this year's Thanksgiving assignment? Have you
Oh
given it yet?
God. You know what? I actually don't know if it's I don't know if it's written yet because I think we have 3 weeks in between the election and Thanksgiving. So I don't know that their prompts are loaded into Canvas yet. And if there's any students watching, they'll say like that makes sense because this year I have been very much like a week out. I'm like, and here's what we're doing, and here's what we're doing because it just keeps changing so quickly.
Yeah. What are you having your students do on election night?
So they all get election day off. And the way that we've sort of approached we always have like one semester long project. is they've been broken up into teams of 3, and they each have a different swing state, and they've been tasked with making a model to predict which way the electoral college is going to go in that state, and then which way each of their house races are going to go, and then one additional race, whether that be like a ballot initiative in the state or the Senate race, or if they have something else that they're considering. And so on election day, they have to pre-register their predictions on Monday. Election day is going to happen, and then we get on Thursday, we're going to debrief on like what they got right, what they got wrong, what sorts of voters they were modeling that they thought were going to turn out that maybe didn't. And we won't know all the answers, but it's a time for us to sort of understand how hard academic and professional political science is, because it's a lot of uncertainty. And we have polling data, and they have the betting markets, and they have all sorts of demographic stuff and stuff that they're working with right now, but it's uncertain. And that's sort of like the beauty and the fun of it. But it's also something that I like giving them a project like this, because then they can appreciate it instead of saying like, "Ooh, the pundits get it wrong." And it's like, guys, this is really hard stuff to figure out. So let's put ourselves in their seats and see what they can get right.
That's powerful. I like that. I was interested to read in your book that you were not raised in a home where politics was talked about.
Yeah, that's correct. I was raised in Kansas, and I was raised in certainly like a loving home, and I was raised in a home that understood that we were a part of a bigger community. I was in a religious and a faith-based home. We were raised Catholic, but I never went and voted with my parents. I didn't know where voting happened. I never talked with them about politics. I never talked with any of my family about politics. And part of that was that it was clear and explicit that those were like off limits conversations. So like I'm sure if like myself or one of my brothers would have waded into it, it would have been like, don't do this. And actually, I kind of know that that's true, because that sometimes that persists to this day. Like I went on a full family trip this last summer, and we were having a conversation. The book, was written, it wasn't out yet. And one of my brothers tried to talk about something with me, and I was like so excited to do it. And my dad, who I love more than anyone else, was like, "We're not doing this at the dinner table." I was like, "I think we are doing this. I think that's what we're
Yeah.
going to do, because I think
Right.
that's what we need to do. I think that's a healthy thing. If we can't do this here with people who we love, people who we trust, how are we meant to do this with other people who we have like, a less certain relationship with? This is the practice round, and know that we're going to love each other on the other side of it. But we have to start doing it somewhere. And I think homes that have the ability to do that make their own home units stronger. And then that sort of ripples out, because you have these models for not just your home, but you can say like, "Oh, when we bring friends over, they see it this way, or they change it." And so, yeah, I was not raised in a political home. But now that I have, like the homemaking of my own, I certainly do have a daughter who's steeped in this, and all my extended friends and family who end up being a part of these conversations know that it's important to me. And it's not used as a tool to judge or a tool to assess others, but just to say like, I care about how we're coming at these problems. Let's have it out. Let's talk about this.
Yeah. Do you think that folks who maybe are listening tonight, or folks who you're meeting, on the road as you tour with this book, could find lessons in the book that would be applicable outside of the parenting realm? So maybe you're on a school board, maybe you're on, a committee at a faith-based organization, maybe you're part of, some sort of system or structure where you want to get politics on the table, and you want to inform, and you want to engage, and you want to learn. Are there lessons in here that transcend parenting and family that could be applied to other situations? um, name the situation.
Yeah, so this book is written primarily understanding that parents, caregivers, educators, grandparents are going to be the audiences, but I think there's definitely things to learn from people who care about this issue, but maybe don't find themselves in that sort of life stage right now. One of the things that I always like to stress is you never know whose civic role model you're going to be. You never know what kids are looking up to you. You never know what they're seeing. And so it's important for us to sort of demonstrate this behavior. But in terms of like the research part of this book, this front end part of the book, there are so many things for us to take and say like, ooh, if we want to make our systems better, we first have to know what's going wrong. And so something that I like about this is one of the things that we did is we looked at the nation's report card around the United States, And if you sum this up, only about 23% of our students are considered proficient at 8th grade in understanding what they should know about civics. That's not great, and it hasn't changed from 1998 until today. And so, like, if you're like, "Ooh, we need to do more on this," yes, we have really long indicators that we haven't been doing better by our young children and how they're learning this or how they're approaching this. And then another thing that we did is we went and looked at AP US government scores. And AP US government, this test is administered throughout the United States. Only about 2% of US students ever opt into this class, but it is routinely one of the lowest scoring AP US exams that are offered. On average, our students earn less than a 3, which means on that 5-point scale, they don't even get college credit for it. When we look at the 2023 test scores for all of the 38 administered AP governments or AP tests, AP US government is the 37th lowest, despite the fact that everyone who takes this test, for the most part, goes on to live under the United States politics and government system, but most of them don't understand it. And so for people who aren't finding themselves as raising children right now, but who care about the performance, the functions, the feelings of our government, there are things to learn in what we're not getting right now in these settings to be able to advocate for either more robust education in schools, more robust institutional supports outside of schools, more societal appropriateness of having these conversations. I think there is something for people who aren't just saying, how do I get this work done with my kids? Because there's lessons in this research piece that really transcend the family structure that say societally we have a bit of a breakdown that we need to deal with.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I agree. And I kept thinking that as I was reading the book. We don't have a ton more time, but I did want to ask, and we can go into this in after hours too, but for those of you who buy a book and get to come to after hours, you talk about 5 key civic skills that all kids should have. Can you kind of like go down the list of those
Yeah.
5?
So I break it up, in the book. There's ages 5 through 9, 10 to 14, and 15 to 18. And these 5 things that I have are these ones that are like, before the kids leave your house, they have to have these pieces. And the way that we came up with this list is in talking to teachers, because we interviewed teachers in nearly every US state. And it kind of was like, what are they missing in most curricula? And then what it is on the other side to know what they need to participate. And so the first one is our kids need to know how to register to vote. And why that is a parenting responsibility is because despite the fact you think schools might take care of it, on average, they don't. When we look at our last federal election, fewer than a quarter of our 18 to 22-year-olds voted. And most of that hurdle is that they are not registered in the first place. Depending on what state you live in, your children are going to have to navigate different systems. In some states, even big states like Texas, there's not online voter registration. And so they're going to have to like fill out forms. They're going to have to address an envelope. They're going to have to get a stamp. Young people aren't used to doing this. Parents have to help them with it. And often you have to have a social security number depending on your state. But when you first register, most of our 18-year-olds don't know their social security number. It's like in a card that maybe mom or dad had. So you have to do that. The second thing that you have to be sure that they understand is the difference between primary and general elections. And one of the reasons that this is key is because when we teach civics throughout the United States, we very rarely talk about primary elections. It's all sort of this final November election. If we talk about a primary at all, it's the presidential primary, which is unique and not like any other primaries we have. But increasingly in the United States, the election that matters, and what I mean by that, the one that picks the eventual representative, is that primary. It's not the general election because our districts are so counterbalanced where you're going to have whoever wins the primary gets through. The third thing is I think your children should all have read the Constitution at least once before they leave your house. And why I say that is because it's the rule book, it's the charter of government, and no one likes playing a game they don't know the rules to. It's not easy to play something that you don't understand. And so it's not that you sit down with your 7-year-old and say, like, okay, we're reading the Constitution tonight, but it is to say that in the course of the 18 years that you have with them, you've gone through all the pieces at one point. And I have an entire chapter 7 is like, here's how it works. Here's conversation starters you can have. You can do this on your commute. You can do it at the dinner table. You can do it over a lifetime that you have with them. But make sure they know all these little touchstones so that they can go through the world understanding the rules of the game they're going to play. The fourth one is that they need to have a sense of federalism, which is kind of a simple concept, but one that's often glossed over in schools, which is simply the idea that The local government does different things than the state government, does different things than the federal government. Sometimes they overlap, but there's some powers that even the president doesn't have. So if your child's like, I wish school started 5 minutes later, the president's not going to fix that. That's going to be a school board that's going to do that. That's going to be like a board of regents who gets to decide these things. And so knowing that there's different levels that are responsible for different layers of government is really powerful, instead of just thinking, oh, there's like this nefarious big government somewhere out there that does everything.
The guy in
There's
charge.
different, yeah, someone in DC. No. And then the last thing is sort of this all-encompassing one, which is we need to have practice in having hard conversations. Because as someone who sees college students on the other side of it, I often get young people who are very afraid of being uncomfortable themselves, and they're afraid of potentially making someone else uncomfortable. I'm not saying we need to like throw around violent rhetoric with each other, but we need to know that it's okay having a conversation where you feel a little bit out of your depth, or if you feel like a little bit squishy on the topic. And that's something that our kids cannot create on their own. They can't create it in a vacuum. It's not incentivized in online deliberation. It's something we have to do interpersonally. And so I think all of our parents who want our kids to be as powerful as possible, as mentally healthy and resilient as possible, and as successful as possible, should be willing to take the time to show them what it is to have hard conversations. What's that give and take? What does it mean to make a mistake? What does it mean to apologize? What does it mean to learn more? Those are the 5 things that your kids should have a grasp on before they leave their house, and they're probably not going to get all of that in schools.
Yeah, that's a fantastic list. I'm glad this is being recorded because I wasn't taking notes. I want to make sure I tick every one of those boxes. Thank you so much. This is such a phenomenal conversation, and Lonnie's joining us, so that's our cue to wrap it up, but thank you.
Heidi, thank you for the questions. That was really nice to do that with you.
Heidi, echoing that, thank you for helping to walk everyone through Lindsey's work. You hit it all. I always appreciate how prepared you are when you come here. You're not just looking like, oh, the book. It's also you're looking at newsletters and things that are getting published and op-eds and videos and everything. And so there's you have a great way of being very associative throughout the conversation. So I very much appreciate that. I want to remind everybody we're going to be doing after hours with both Heidi and Lindsey. It's going to be starting at 8:05 Central, which is in about 8 minutes from now. This webinar right now will end at 8. They'll have a 5-minute break, and then the after hours Zoom will be open and you can come hang out. The way that you get to come to after hours is buy a copy of Lindsey's very good book, How to Raise a Citizen. Buy a copy. We've been putting the links in chat. It's there. Anne-Marie just popped it in one more time. Buy a copy of the book. And I have it right up here. In the receipt that you get from our bookseller, the bookstall, you will see the link to register for after hours. Fan is giving a second copy. We're pretty convinced that you have someone, you have a family member, you have a teacher, you have a friend, you have maybe a local community leader, somebody who's in a nonprofit, somebody who can benefit from having a copy of this book. Great for if you're an early shopper for holiday season, great holiday season book. We're going to give a second copy to everyone at after hours. So buy a copy, come to after hours. There's plenty of questions I'm sure people will have. Lindsey is clearly very effective in terms of how to navigate lots of great ideas and concepts about how to present things in a very fresh and novel way. So I very much appreciate that as well. I'm curious at after hours, and I wonder if you have a very quick answer for me. I'm curious about those AP Gov test scores. Did you have a sense as to why AP Gov in particular? I mean, someone out of 38 topics, somebody has to be number 38, some test score has to be number 38. But I'm just kind of curious, do you have a sense as to why the underlying piece as to why the AP Gov is so low?
Yeah, so when talking with AP government teachers, part of the thing is it's really hard to come in and learn everything in your second semester of your senior year of high school. You know, with every other subject, they have some fluency K through 12. They're going to have a touch point. For most of the United States, you usually have 7th or 8th grade. You're going to get like US history or some sort of like world history thing. And then we don't touch this again until whatever sort of civics class you're going to have, which is usually second semester your senior year. And so they just don't have all the like sort of building blocks vocabulary. It's too much to give them and then be like, okay, 3 months from now, you're going to have a test. Whereas with every other subject, they just like know a little bit more because it's been scaffolded.
I'd be curious if that was pegged because I'm thinking about my son's school at ETHS. They do civics as sophomore. They take a semester of sophomore history for the civic sequence, which is earlier than the time period. I'm wondering if that would have an effect. But I will continue to wonder these little questions. It's now 8:00, and so we're now done. Everybody come join us in 5 minutes. Come hang out with these two brilliant individuals. Ask your own questions. Great topic. I didn't feel my blood pressure going up at any point. Isn't that nice?
So we
Nice little break.
All right. So thanks so much. And we'll see you guys in about 5 minutes. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Lonnie. Thanks, Lindsay.